Một người đàn ông bước vào phòng cung cấp lúc 3 giờ sáng, áo vest xé toạc, mũ mềm qua lũa lừa tiền. Và khi ánh mắt anh ta chạm vào cô y tá kiệt sức đứng trước mặt, cô cảm thấy một điều mà cô không thể giải thích. Đây không phải nhân bệnh bình thường, đây là người có thể đánh dấu cuộc đời cô chỉ bằng một cái gật đầu. Câu chuyện đêm nay sẽ đưa bạn vào thế giới của một người phụ nữ sống sót qua bi kịch, rồi đối mặt với điều còn đáng sợ hơn, cảm giác muốn sống lại. Hãy nhận thích và bình luận tên thành phố bạn đang xem để tôi biết câu chuyện của mình đã đi được bao xa nhé.
The rain came in sideways that night, hammering the glass doors of Mercy St. Jude's emergency entrance with the kind of relentless fury that made nurses check the ceiling for leaks and residents double-check their coffee cups weren't empty. It was 3:17 in the morning, and Rowan Vale had been on her feet for 11 hours. Her sneakers squeaked on the linoleum. She'd stopped noticing. She moved between curtained bays with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had learned to separate her body from her mind sometime around hour 6. Checking drips, noting charts, answering questions from people who looked at her like she might have answers to things that went beyond medicine. A 60-year-old man in Bay 4 who kept asking about his son. A teenager in Bay 7 who wouldn't say where the bruises came from. Rowan documented everything, asked the right questions, touched shoulders when touching was the only language that worked. Then she moved on, because the next curtain was always waiting, and the night was always longer than it looked. She hadn't always been this way. 3 years ago, Rowan Vale had been one of the top surgical residents in Boston, the kind of student that department heads pointed to when they needed an example of what dedication looked like. She'd had a future that spread out in front of her like something earned, a surgical fellowship, a research position, an apartment that didn't smell like the walls were tired. She'd had Daniel, who laughed too loud in movie theaters and made terrible eggs on Sunday mornings, and once drove 4 hours in a snowstorm to bring her a coat she'd left at her mother's house. Daniel, who had died on the floor of a convenience store on Alston Street on a Tuesday night in November, while Rowan pressed her hands against the wound in his chest and felt, with absolute clinical precision, the exact moment when pressure and technique stopped mattering. She'd finished her residency. She hadn't gone back to surgery. Some doors close because you stop reaching for the handle. Now she worked emergency at Mercy St. Jude, double shifts 3 times a week, taking every overnight the schedule offered because the overnight shifts paid a differential, and her grandmother's assisted care facility didn't reduce its fees for people who were grieving. The debt was not abstract. It was a number she wrote in the margin of her checkbook every month, a number that didn't move as fast as she needed it to, a number that was currently $74,000 and change. Rowan wasn't surviving her life. She was servicing it. She was refilling a medication tray behind the nurse's station when the entrance doors burst open at 3:22 a.m. She heard it before she saw it. Not the doors, but the energy that came through them. A pressure change, like the room inhaled. The 2 security guards at the desk both stood up at the same time, and that was unusual enough to make Rowan look. 3 men came in fast. The 2 flanking were big, suited, moving with the low-shouldered tension of people accustomed to being the most dangerous thing in any given space. They swept the waiting area with their eyes before their feet had fully cleared the entrance, a habit that wasn't security work. It was something older and more fundamental than that. The man between them was the one Rowan couldn't look away from. Tall, dark overcoat over what had once been an expensive suit, the jacket hanging open, the white dress shirt beneath it soaked dark from the ribs downward. His face was controlled in a way that looked effortful, jaw set, eyes forward, breathing through his nose in the measured cadence of someone managing pain by deciding it didn't have authority over him. He was pale beneath a natural olive complexion. He was bleeding significantly. He also looked, when his eyes moved to Rowan, like a man who had already assessed everything in the room and made his decisions about all of it. She stepped out from behind the station before she made the conscious choice to do it. "I need a room," one of the flanking men said. He wasn't talking to the guards. He was talking to whoever would handle this fastest. "He needs a trauma bay," Rowan said. "How long has he been bleeding?" 40 minutes. "Mechanism?" The man looked at her like the question was a problem he didn't intend to solve. "He needs a room." Rowan looked at the patient directly. He was watching her with an expression that was difficult to categorize. Not distressed, not grateful, not confused. He was watching her the way someone watches a situation they're still deciding whether to manage or allow. "Can you walk?" she asked him. I walked in, he said. His voice was low, unhurried, the accent neither regional nor affected, just controlled. Everything about him was controlled. Trauma 2, Rowan said to the aide behind her. She didn't wait for confirmation. Get me a cart. She took him down the hall herself. The two men followed. She didn't invite them, and she didn't object. She'd learned a long time ago that arguing with people in high-escalation states was a conversation you had after the emergency, not during it. Bay 2 had its cart prepped, light rigged overhead, a green curtain that she pulled across the entrance before turning to face him. I need the coat and shirt off, she said. He removed the overcoat himself, a slow, deliberate movement that made it clear every degree of rotation in that shoulder cost him, and handed it to one of the men behind him without looking. His shirt buttons took longer. Rowan watched his hands, checking for tremor, checking the rate of the soak spreading through the fabric. When she helped him ease the shirt over his right shoulder, she saw the wound. It ran from just below the right nipple line diagonally up toward his armpit. 8, maybe 9 centimeters, clean-edged, deep. Not a gunshot, a blade. A very deliberate blade drawn at an angle that suggested the attacker knew anatomy well enough to miss the lung on purpose, or not to miss it accidentally. This is a knife wound, Rowan said. Yes, he said. I need to ask how it happened for the report. No, he said, just that. Not aggressive, simply terminal. Rowan pressed gauze against the wound with enough pressure to make a lesser man flinch. He didn't flinch. She looked up at his face. He was looking at the ceiling with the focused detachment of someone who had separated from his body more times than she had. I need a name, she said. Lucien, he said. He gave her nothing else. She worked quickly because quick was what the wound needed. She had the aide retrieve a suture kit, a proper irrigation setup, lidocaine that the patient declined with a short lateral movement of his head that left no interpretive room. He declined the anesthesia the way most people decline the weather, not with emotion, simply with the assumption that their preference was the outcome. You'll feel this, Rowan told him. I know, he said. She irrigated the wound with the thoroughness it required, watching for depth, checking the tissue condition at the edges. The blade had been clean. Whoever wielded it knew what they were doing. She began placing sutures with the particular focused quiet that comes from a decade of training. The hands working on a different frequency than the brain free to notice that the patient's breathing was steady, but his blood pressure, when she checked it, was lower than she wanted, and that despite the control visible in every line of his body, there was something at the edges of his eyes that told her he had been in this room, or rooms like it before. You've had wounds treated like this before, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, he said, without anesthesia? A brief pause. Pain management is a variable I've learned to work around. That's not what I asked. He looked at her then, fully, directly, and the quality of the attention was startling. Not many people looked at Rowan Vale like she was worth the full allocation of their focus. Most people in pain looked past nurses, through them, toward whatever outcome they were waiting for. Lucien looked at her like she was a document he was reading carefully, taking his time with the parts that mattered. No, he said. I suppose it wasn't. She tied off the 4th suture and moved to the 5th without responding. His ribs expanded and contracted beneath her hands in a rhythm that was genuinely impressive for someone with a freshly lacerated intercostal region. Your hands are shaking, he said. I've been working for 11 hours. Does that bother you? My hands or the 11 hours? Either. Rowan placed the 6th suture, pulled thread, cut. Neither is your concern. She heard something in the silence after that. Not quite a sound, more of a shift in atmospheric pressure. Like whatever he was, it had registered her answer and found it worth keeping. She dressed the wound. She gave him antibiotics in an IV she'd placed without asking permission, because the wound's depth made it non-negotiable, and she'd watched him assess her enough times to understand he would accept competence even when he rejected consultation. His blood pressure came up 4 points in 20 minutes. She wrote it in the chart. She was already aware no one was going to file with the police department tonight. Somewhere between the IV placement and the blood pressure check, Rowan became aware of the particular quality of silence coming from behind the curtain. She'd worked enough trauma shifts to know the difference between the silence of waiting rooms and the silence of men doing protective surveillance. The two men outside the bay weren't security guards. They were something her body understood before her brain finished categorizing it. The patient lying on her gurney was not a wealthy man who had been in a fight. He was something else, something that had edges she couldn't see the full shape of yet. She finished her documentation and straightened. You're going to need a follow-up in 48 hours for the suture line. The infection risk with this depth is significant. If you develop fever above 101, the wound needs to be assessed immediately. Understood, he said. That means by a physician, not by someone stitching you without anesthesia in a parking structure. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, the technical possibility of one. He sat up slowly. Reached into the interior pocket of the overcoat, one of his men passed through the curtain, withdrew an envelope and held it toward her. Rowan looked at it, looked at him. That's not how billing works, she said. It's not for billing, he said. I can't accept that. You've been on your feet for 11 hours in shoes that need replacing, treating patients you can't fix with resources that aren't sufficient in a hospital that is underfunding this department by a significant margin. He set the envelope on the edge of the gurney beside him. It isn't charity, it's proportion. Rowan didn't pick it up. He stood, carefully, fully, with the controlled reassembly of someone deciding which degree of upright posture their body could currently support, and buttoned a clean shirt that appeared from somewhere she hadn't tracked. His overcoat went back over his shoulders. He looked, when he was dressed, like someone whose violence belonged to a world she didn't have access to. At the curtain he paused. He looked back at her with that same full allocation attention, and for a moment Rowan felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years, the specific, unwelcome sensation of being truly seen by someone. You look like someone surviving instead of living, he said. It wasn't an observation offered with pity. It wasn't cruel. It was simply accurate, and the accuracy of it landed somewhere beneath her sternum and stayed there after the curtain swung closed and the sound of his departure, efficient, quiet, leaving no trace, faded into the ambient noise of the hospital night. Rowan stood in the empty bay for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she picked up the envelope. She told herself she'd return it. She told herself she'd figure out how. She tucked it into her scrub pocket and went back to the floor. And the night continued the way nights do, indifferent to what had just changed inside her. She found out what was in the envelope on the walk to her car at 6:45 that morning. Standing in the cold concrete of the parking structure with rain dripping through the open levels, she opened it in the gray light and counted $50 bills until she reached the number that made her stop breathing for a moment. $4,000. Rowan stood there with the money in both hands and the rain hitting her shoulders and thought about her grandmother's facility payment due in 9 days, the auto debit for her student loan hitting in 12, the leak under her kitchen sink that a plumber had quoted at $380 and she'd been patching with towels for 3 weeks. She thought about what it meant to accept money from a man she couldn't name in any documentation. She thought about what it meant to need it badly enough that she was standing here counting it instead of walking back inside to give it back. She put it in her bag and drove home. The black SUV was parked across from her building's entrance. She noticed it because it was running in a no-parking zone at 7 in the morning with no one visibly inside and the windows tinted dark enough to be incongruous. She noticed it because she'd been a woman living alone in a city long enough to notice things that didn't fit the frame. She told herself it was coincidence. She took her elevator to the 4th floor, let herself into the apartment that smelled like the radiator needed bleeding and the coffee she'd left in the pot 2 days ago, and showered until the hot water ran out. She slept 4 hours. When she woke to her alarm at 2 in the afternoon, she walked to her window and looked down at the street. The SUV was still there. A different one, she thought, and then felt cold when she realized she wasn't sure and didn't know how to be sure, and that the distinction suddenly felt like the most important thing in the world. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Unknown number. She answered it because in 11 years of nursing, she'd learned that unknown numbers sometimes meant something had happened to someone she was responsible for, and you answered those calls even when your chest felt like it was doing something it wasn't supposed to do. "Ms. Vale," said a voice she recognized immediately, not because she'd heard it enough times to memorize it,
but because it was not a voice that required multiple exposures. I owe you an explanation. Rowan stood at her window with the phone against her ear and the SUV in her peripheral vision and the $4,000 in an envelope on her kitchen counter, and felt the very specific, very unpleasant sensation of understanding that she had already crossed a threshold she hadn't chosen to approach. "Who gave you my number?" she said. "That's a smaller question than the ones you should be asking," Lucy Yen said. "Who are you?" A pause. Outside, a pigeon landed on the windowsill, looked at her with its red-rimmed eye, and departed. "Someone who needs you to listen carefully," he said, "and then decide whether you're going to make a decision that most people in your position would make very badly." Rowan's hand tightened on the phone. "What decision?" she said. "Whether you're going to get in the car," he said, "or whether you're going to wait for the men watching your building to be replaced by people I don't control." The cold settled into her fully then. Not the shock cold of surprise, but the slower, deeper cold of understanding arriving. She looked at the SUV. She looked at the envelope on her counter. She thought about the way he had looked at her. Not like a man who wanted something from her, but like a man who already knew something about her that she hadn't decided to share. "If I get in that car," she said, "you tell me everything." Another pause, longer this time. "More than you'll want to know," he said. "But yes." Rowan Vale stood in her apartment that smelled like loneliness and a leaking sink and 3 years of choosing survival over anything else, and made the decision that would detonate the careful wreckage of the life she'd built. She picked up her medical bag. She walked out the door. The SUV smelled like leather and something chemical, gun oil, maybe, or the particular antiseptic used on surfaces that needed to stay clean for reasons that had nothing to do with hygiene. Rowan sat in the back with her medical bag on her lap and her hands flat on top of it, pressing down like the weight of her own palms could anchor her to something reasonable. The man in the passenger seat hadn't spoken since she got in. The driver hadn't looked at her once. The city moved past the tinted windows in the gray morning light. Coffee shops opening, delivery trucks idling, ordinary people doing ordinary things on the other side of the glass. And Rowan watched it recede with the feeling of someone watching ashore from a boat that's already too far out to swim back from. She'd left a note on her counter. She didn't know why. It said, "Going out. Back tonight." She'd addressed it to no one because there was no one to address it to, and the fact of that, the small, flat fact of her own solitude, had hit her harder than it usually did as she pulled the door shut behind her. The drive took 47 minutes. She tracked it on her watch because tracking things was what kept her functional, had kept her functional for 3 years. The small ritual of documentation substituting for the larger architecture of a life that had structure and direction and someone who laughed too loud in movie theaters. They left the city proper somewhere around the 20-minute mark, the highway narrowing into a 2-lane road that climbed steadily through bare winter trees. By the 40-minute mark, the trees had thickened into something that felt genuinely remote. The kind of landscape that suggested the distance between here and help was a number worth knowing. The estate appeared through iron gates that opened before the driver touched anything. Sensors, cameras, someone watching from inside who made the decision to allow them through. The driveway was long and paved and curved slightly, lined with security lighting that hadn't been turned off for the day. The house at the end of it was enormous and glass-fronted and cold-looking in a way that had nothing to do with architecture, the coldness of a space where warmth had never been the point. Rowan counted 4 armed men visible before the car stopped. She assumed there were more she couldn't see. The man from the passenger seat opened her door. She got out with her bag. A woman met her at the entrance, mid-50s, steel-haired, wearing an expression that had been polished smooth of anything interpretable. She introduced herself as Mrs. Carver and said nothing beyond that. "Where is he?" Rowan said. "This way," Mrs. Carver said. The interior of the house was the kind of expensive that didn't need to announce itself. Stone floors, high ceilings, art on the walls that Rowan suspected cost more than her annual salary without looking particularly enjoyable. She followed Mrs. Carver up a wide staircase and down a hallway that turned once and then again and stopped at a door that the woman opened without knocking. The room was dim. Blackout curtains, 1 lamp on a low setting, the particular stillness of a space that had been arranged for someone in pain. The bed was large and the man in it looked smaller than he had in the trauma bay, not physically, but in the way that illness reduces people, strips the authority from them, and leaves something more human and more difficult beneath. Lucien Moretti was running a fever. Rowan could see it from the doorway. The flush across his cheekbones, the slight labor in his breathing, the way his eyes opened when she came in, aware, tracking, but slower than last night, working harder to focus. She crossed the room and set her bag on the side table without asking permission. "The wound's infected," she said. "I'm aware," he said. "I told you 48 hours. It's been 9. There were complications with the schedule." She pulled back the covers without ceremony and lifted the edge of his shirt to look at the dressing she'd applied. Even from the outside, she could see the problem. The fabric discolored, the area around the suture line puffy with the particular tautness of tissue responding badly to something it had absorbed. She peeled the dressing back carefully and looked at what the night had done. "This is bad," she said. "Tell me something I haven't already decided," he said. "You need a hospital." "No." "The infection. No hospital." His voice was quiet, but the firmness in it was load-bearing. "You have what you need in that bag, or you tell me what you need, and I'll have it here in 20 minutes. But not a hospital." Rowan looked at the wound, looked at him. "There are things I can't do outside a clinical setting. And there are things I can't do inside one," he said. "We're both working with limitations tonight." She pulled her bag open and started working. She didn't like it. She made sure he knew she didn't like it by the specific quality of her silence, which was different from the silence of acceptance, and which he appeared to register without comment. She cleaned the wound thoroughly, applied a topical antimicrobial, started him on an oral antibiotic protocol from the supplies in her bag. She'd grabbed the kit from the supply closet on instinct, the same instinct that had been keeping her functional for 3 years, the part of her brain that cataloged worst-case scenarios and packed for them. She set up an IV line for fluids because his hydration was poor. She took his temperature, 102.4, and his blood pressure, and wrote both numbers in the small notebook she kept in her bag's front pocket, the one where she wrote things she needed to remember and things she needed to be able to prove. He watched her work with that same full allocation attention from the night before, undimmed by the fever, which told her the fever wasn't as high as it could get before he started losing the careful architecture of his control. "You packed a full medical kit," he said. "I'm a nurse who got into a car with strangers at 7 in the morning," she said. "Yes." A pause. "Smart," he said. "Alive," she corrected. "Same thing." She sat in the chair beside the bed and looked at him directly. "You said you'd tell me everything." "I said more than you'd want to know." "Start talking." He looked at the ceiling for a moment. In the low light, with the fever coloring his face and the IV line running from his arm, he looked like something stripped of its armor, still dangerous, the way certain animals are dangerous even when they're wounded and still, but reduced to something she could look at without the particular vertigo of last night. "My name is Lucien Moretti," he said. "You won't find a criminal record under that name. You'll find a property development company, 3 shell corporations, and a charitable foundation that funds pediatric literacy programs in 4 states. What you won't find, what doesn't exist in any publicly accessible document, is the actual structure of what I manage." "Which is what?" Rowan said. "An organization," he said, "that operates in the spaces between what law enforcement has the resources to monitor, financial infrastructure, distribution networks, certain kinds of enforcement that the legitimate economy requires, but declines to acknowledge it requires." He paused. "The East Coast chapter of what some federal databases call the Moretti Syndicate." Rowan's hands were still. She was aware of them being still, of the deliberate quality of her own stillness. "How large?" she said. "Large enough that the man who tried to open my chest last night considered it worth the attempt." "Who was he?" "An employee of a rival organization called the Volkov Circle. They operate out of 3 states and have been attempting to expand into territory that currently belongs to my network. Last night was an opening statement." His eyes moved to her face. "Not a spontaneous one." "What does that have to do with me?" His jaw tightened slightly. "A microscopic movement
the kind that meant he was deciding how much of something to hand over. When my men brought you in last night, they followed standard security protocol. They swept your vehicle, your bag, and found a GPS transmitter the size of a thumbnail attached to the interior lining of the bag's front pocket. He watched her. It wasn't there when you packed the bag this morning. It was placed sometime during your last shift. The room was very quiet. Rowan thought about the bag, thought about where it lived during a shift. The nurse's station, the supply room, the locker room at the end of the hallway where the lock on her locker had been sticking for 2 months, and she'd filed a maintenance request that nobody had acted on. She thought about the 47-minute drive and the iron gates and the 4 armed men she could see from the driveway. They tracked you, she said, through me. Through you, he confirmed, which means someone at that hospital or with access to that hospital knew you would be treating me before you knew it yourself. That's not possible. It's not comfortable, he said. That's different. Rowan stood up. She wasn't sure when she'd decided to stand, but her body had made the decision before she processed it, the autonomic response of someone whose system had just registered threat. She walked to the window and, blackout curtain, she couldn't see anything, which somehow made it worse, and stood with her back to him for a moment. So, I'm not here because you needed follow-up care, she said. You're here because you're safer here than in your apartment for the next 72 hours while my people trace the device and identify how far the Volkov network has penetrated your hospital. You kidnapped me. I invited you into a car, with armed men watching my building, for your protection. That's what people say when they want the word kidnapping to sound like something else. She turned around. He was watching her with the fever-flushed focus of a man who had decided to let her have the anger because he'd already calculated that it was going to happen and there was no efficient alternative to allowing it. My grandmother has a care payment due in 9 days. I have a shift at Mercy St. Jude in 16 hours. The payment will be made, he said. She stopped. I have your grandmother's facility information, he said. The payment will go through before the due date. Your shift. You'll call in sick, which you have not done in 14 months, which your supervisor will find unusual but not actionable. His voice was patient in a way that suggested he'd already walked through all of this, the same way he'd walked through every variable in every room, already 3 steps ahead and waiting for the conversation to arrive. I'm not asking you to disappear. I'm asking you to stay inside a secure location for 72 hours while a problem that involves you through no choice of your own gets resolved. And then what? And then you go back to your life. My life, she said, which now includes knowing that the head of an organized crime syndicate knows my grandmother's account number. Something crossed his face. It wasn't guilt. She didn't think guilt was a territory he visited often, but it was close to acknowledgement, the specific acknowledgement of a man who understood that the collateral effects of the way he moved through the world were not abstract. Yes, he said simply. That's accurate. Rowan sat back down in the chair. Not because she felt better, because her legs were tired and her anger needed somewhere stable to operate from. Tell me about the Volkov Circle, she said. He told her. He spoke for 40 minutes, pausing only when a fresh wave of fever made his breathing labor slightly, and she made him drink from the water glass on the nightstand, which he did without objecting, which told her more about how bad he felt than anything else had. He spoke about the Volkov Circle the way someone speaks about a weather pattern, with precision, without dramatics, tracking its movements and its pressure points and the specific ways in which it had been escalating for the past 18 months. He spoke about his own organization the same way, not with pride, not with apology, with the flat descriptive accuracy of a man explaining the structure of something he'd built and lived inside long enough to know every load-bearing wall. His parents had been killed when he was 11. He mentioned it the way someone mentions a fact about the geography of a place they grew up in, present in the landscape, formative, no longer raw. His father had been the previous head of the Moretti operation. The men who killed him had been allies. Internal. People who'd calculated that the transition of power was an opportunity and been wrong, terminally, because they hadn't accounted for what an 11-year-old boy growing up in the structure of that world would become when he had sufficient time and sufficient motivation. You built all of this to avenge them, Rowan said. I built all of this because it was what I knew how to do, he said. Revenge was an early motivation. It stopped being sufficient a long time ago. What replaced it? He looked at her. The fever had climbed slightly. She could see it in the increased flush, hear it in the slight roughness that had entered his breathing over the last 20 minutes. Control, he said. The absence of the feeling I had at 11 years old, which was the feeling of having no control over what happened to the people I couldn't protect. Rowan was quiet. That's not a justification, he said. I know, she said. I wasn't going to offer you one. He looked at her with something that shifted slightly in his expression, a fractional recalibration, like a man who'd made an assumption about what came next and found it didn't hold. You're not afraid of me, he said. I work emergency overnight at a city hospital, she said. I've had patients try to take swings at me, patients threaten my family, patients come in with wounds they made themselves. Fear is a resource I allocate carefully. She checked his IV line. Right now you have a fever of 102 and you're on fluids in your own bed with 2 of my sutures doing the structural work. You're not the most immediately threatening thing in my professional week. He was quiet for a long moment. Your fiancé, he said. She went still. Daniel Reyes, Lucian said. November 14th, 3 years ago. I'm not... He stopped, and the pause was unusually unguarded for him. I had you looked into before my men brought you here. I wanted to know who was going to be inside this house. His eyes were steady on her face. I'm not raising it to use it. I'm raising it because you said fear is a resource, and I recognize the specific quality of the calm you carry, and I know where it comes from, because I carry a version of the same thing. Rowan's hands were very still in her lap. Don't, she said. Her voice was level. Don't do that. Do what? Use a dead man to make me feel like we have something in common. She looked at him directly. We don't have something in common. You build empires out of violence. He died because of it. Those aren't comparable losses. The silence afterward was different from the other silences. Heavier. He'd pushed on something real and found it was exactly as structural as it looked, and she could see him registering that, not backing away from it, but giving it the weight it deserved. You're right, he said. She hadn't expected that. I'm sorry, he said, for raising it. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood up, checked his temperature again, 102.6, climbing, and adjusted his IV rate. Sleep, she said. The antibiotic needs time. Fever should break by morning if we're managing this right. Stay in the house, he said. It wasn't a request exactly, but it wasn't the command it would have been 24 hours ago either. I don't have anywhere else to go, she said. She meant it as simple fact. She hadn't meant the weight that came with it. The specific gravity of being a woman whose life had contracted to the point where a criminal's fortified estate in the mountains was as legitimate an option as anywhere else. She heard it land that way. She could tell he did too. She left him to sleep and found Mrs. Carver waiting in the hallway, who showed her to a room without being asked. The room had a window that faced the grounds, and Rowan stood at it in the near dark and watched the security lights move and counted the men she could see patrolling the perimeter and tried to build an accurate picture of where she was inside this. She had treated a man she couldn't report. She had accepted money she couldn't account for. She had gotten into a car. She was standing in a room inside a fortress while somewhere in the city a criminal organization had placed a tracking device in her bag, which meant someone who knew her movements, her schedule, her habits. Someone with access to Mercy St. Jude had given that information to people who used human beings as delivery mechanisms for GPS coordinates. Her phone had signal. She checked. 3 bars. She could call the police. She built the scenario out in her mind. The call, the response time, the explanation of the tracking device and the car, and the $4,000 on her kitchen counter, the explanation of why she'd gotten into the vehicle voluntarily, the explanation of what she knew and how she knew it, and what she'd treated and where. She thought about what that conversation would look like in a report. She thought about what would happen to her nursing license. She thought about what would happen to her grandmother's care payment. She thought about what Lucien had said, people I can't control, and looked at the armed men moving through the grounds below, and understood that the geometry of her situation was not one that a phone call to the right authority would resolve cleanly. She put her phone back in her pocket. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened her notebook and wrote down everything: times, names, details of the wound, the fever progression, the conversation, in the small, precise handwriting she used when documentation mattered. She didn't know what she was documenting it for. She did it because it was what she did, because recording things was the version of control available to her. She wrote until her hand ached. Then she lay back on the bed without taking her clothes off, one arm across her chest, staring at the ceiling. She was almost asleep when she heard it. Not loud, not dramatic. Just the particular sound of raised voices one floor down. Two men, the words indistinct but the tone unmistakable. The specific register of men who are trying to be quiet while being furious, which meant something was wrong, and the wrong thing was being managed in the way things got managed in a house like this. Then a third voice. Controlled. Fever-roughened but authoritative. Lucien. She sat up. The voices dropped. Silence reasserted itself. Then footsteps in the hallway outside her door, quick, purposeful, and the sound of men moving with the particular urgency of a shift in threat status. Rowan stood, moved to her door, cracked it. The hallway was empty, but for Mrs. Carver at the far end, who was speaking quietly into a phone, her back turned. Rowan's own phone buzzed. Unknown number. Different from the one Lucien had used this morning. She answered it. Static. Then a voice she didn't recognize. Male, accented faintly in a way she couldn't place. Unhurried in the specific way of someone who is unhurried because they have the leverage. Ms. Vale, the voice said, you've been very helpful. More than you know. Her blood went cold. We'd like to speak with you, the voice said. Not tonight, but soon, before Mr. Moretti's men finish running their trace and convince you that your interests and his are aligned. A pause. They're not, by the way. Your interests. You should ask him what happened to the last civilian he brought inside that house. Ask him about the woman named Claire Sutton. Another pause, measured and deliberate. Ask him why her name isn't in any missing persons database. The line went dead. Rowan stood in the doorway of her room in a fortress full of armed men, phone in her hand, the name Claire Sutton sitting in her chest like a stone she hadn't agreed to carry, and understood with absolute clarity that the 72 hours Lucien had described as a problem being resolved was not that at all. It was the beginning of something she didn't have a name for yet, and somewhere in this house, a man with a fever and a sutured knife wound was either the only thing standing between her and the people who'd just called her phone, or he was the reason they had her number. Rowan didn't go back to bed. She stood in the doorway for another 30 seconds after the call ended, long enough to confirm that the hallway was still empty except for Mrs. Carver's turned back, long enough to feel the cold from the stone floor coming through her socks, long enough to understand that whatever she decided to do in the next 10 minutes was going to define the geometry of everything that followed. She went downstairs, not because she had a plan, because staying in a room with a dead phone line and a name she didn't know, Claire Sutton, was worse than moving toward whatever was causing the noise she'd heard. Movement was the version of agency available to her, and Rowan Vale had been surviving on minimum viable agency for 3 years. She knew how to work with what she had. The ground floor was different at this hour. The lighting was lower, concentrated in specific areas. The security station near the entrance, a room to the left with its door cracked, and blue monitor light bleeding through the gap. Two men she hadn't seen before stood at the far end of the main hallway, in a conversation that stopped when she appeared on the stairs. They looked at her with the specific neutral assessment of men deciding whether she was a problem, then looked away, which meant she wasn't. Yet. She followed the light. The room was a study, or had been designed to look like one. Bookshelves, a desk, the kind of architectural gravity that old money uses to signal permanence. But the desk had been cleared and replaced with a temporary operations setup, 2 laptops, a topographic map pinned to a corkboard, a radio unit, and 3 men who all turned when Rowan pushed the door open. One of them was Lucien. He was standing at the desk in a dark shirt, no jacket, the IV line gone from his arm. He'd removed it himself. She could see the cotton ball taped over the insertion point, with both hands flat on the desk surface, looking at the map. He looked up when she came in. His face had the particular quality of a man who has burned through the worst of a fever on sheer force of will and is currently running on something less sustainable. "You should be in bed," she said. "There's been a development," he said. "I know." She held up her phone. Someone called me." The room changed. The two men behind Lucian moved slightly, not toward her, but with the weight shift of heightened attention. Lucian looked at her phone, then at her face. "When?" he said. 10 minutes ago. Unknown number, different from yours." She came further into the room. "They knew my name. They knew I was here. And they told me to ask you about a woman named Claire Sutton." The silence after she said the name was the most instructive thing that had happened since she walked through the front door. It wasn't the silence of confusion. It wasn't the silence of denial. It was the silence of a man who had been holding a specific weight for a specific amount of time and had just heard the exact sound that meant the weight was about to be examined in front of people. One of the men behind Lucian, late 30s, close-cropped hair, a jaw that had been broken and reset slightly off-center, took a step forward. "How did she get that number?" "Nolan," Lucien said. One word. The man stopped. Lucien looked at Rowan for a long moment. The fever flush was still there, but muted, and his eyes were clearer than they'd been 2 hours ago. He was thinking. She could see the calculation moving through him, the sequential assessment of variables, the decision about what version of this conversation to have, and in what order. "Sit down," he said. "Tell me who she is first." "Rowan." He said her name like a full stop. "Sit down." She sat. Not because he told her to, because her legs were doing the thing they did after a very long shift, the thing where the adrenaline that had been substituting for structural stability started to thin out, and her body registered the genuine hours it had been running on empty. Lucien pulled a chair from against the wall and sat across from her, close enough that she could see the effort the upright posture was costing him, far enough that she understood it was deliberate. He was keeping a distance he considered respectful given what he was about to say. "Claire Sutton worked for me," he said. "Not in the organization directly. She was a forensic accountant who contracted with the legitimate side of my financial structure, the development company, the foundations. She was brilliant, thorough, and for 14 months completely unknown to anyone outside the immediate circle of people who needed to know she existed." He paused. 8 months ago, I discovered she had been placed inside my operation by the Volkov Circle. She had been feeding them financial architecture for over a year, account structures, routing information, the specific details that would allow them to map the money flows and identify the real ownership chain behind the legitimate businesses. Rowan waited. "When I confirmed it," he said, "I confronted her." His voice remained level. The levelness of it was its own kind of information. She admitted everything. She said she'd been coerced, that the Volkov people had leverage on her family, a brother with significant debts to people who collected on those debts in ways that went beyond financial. He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her. "I believed her. That was a mistake I've had time to assess." "What happened to her?" Rowan said. "She's alive," he said. "She's in a house in Vermont under protective custody. My people, 3 guards, a location that the Volkov Circle has been trying to identify for 8 months without success. Because she knows enough about their financial structure to reduce their operation to rubble if she ever cooperates with federal investigators, which means they need her found and silenced, and I need her alive and undiscovered." "Then why did they use her name to rattle me?" Nolan, the man with the reset jaw, spoke without being invited to. "Because someone in this house told them she was a pressure point." His voice was flat and operational. "Someone here knew that name would land hard on you specifically, which means someone here has been talking to the Volkov people about you since you arrived this morning." The room contracted. Rowan looked at Lucien. He was looking at Nolan with an expression that told her this was the development he'd been standing over the map thinking about when she walked in. "You have an informant in this house?" she said. "We have a problem in this house," Lucien said. "Whether it's an informant or a compromised communication channel or something else is what we're currently determining." He looked at her directly. "The Volkov Circle called your phone. a phone that has been inside this estate for 10 hours, which means either they had your number before you arrived or someone here provided it.
How many people knew I was coming?
12, Nolan said. The men who picked you up, the men on gate duty, Mrs. Carver, the three of us, and 2 men on perimeter rotation. Narrow it down, Rowan said. Both men looked at her. The call included information that suggested they knew I was here and why I was here, not just that I existed, she said. Whoever gave them my number also told them I was treating Lucien, that I was a civilian, and that I was someone they could potentially use for leverage. That's not a communication leak. That's a briefed contact. She looked at Nolan. Which of your 12 people had enough context to brief someone else on all 4 of those things? Nolan looked at Lucien. Lucien looked at Rowan with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something in the vicinity of being surprised, which, on a face that controlled itself as rigorously as his, was visible only as a fractional recalibration around the eyes. 3 people, Nolan said slowly. Myself, Mrs. Carver, and Reyes. Where's Reyes? Perimeter rotation, Nolan said. He rotated out 40 minutes ago. 40 minutes ago, Rowan said, is approximately when I received the call. The silence this time was not like the other silences. It had urgency in it. The compressed urgency of men who are very good at very dangerous things suddenly redirecting those skills toward an internal problem, which is always the worst kind. Lucien stood. The movement cost him, and he let it cost him, which meant the information in this room had overridden his body's current complaints. Find Reyes, he said to Nolan. Don't make noise about it. Nolan left. The third man, Che, younger, dark eyes, who had not spoken once in Rowan's presence, looked at Lucien and received a silent directive she couldn't decode and followed Nolan out. The room was suddenly just the 2 of them, and the map, and the monitor light, and the sound of rain that had returned sometime in the last hour, hitting the high windows without grace. How long has Reyes been with you? Rowan asked. 6 years, Lucien said. He said it the way you say something that used to mean something specific and has just had that meaning retroactively excavated. Does he know about Claire Sutton's location? A pause. He was part of the team that moved her to Vermont. Rowan watched him absorb that. It was not a clean absorption. The lines around his mouth changed slightly, the jaw setting harder, and she recognized the specific reconfiguration of a person who has just understood that something they trusted was designed to look trustworthy. I'm sorry, she said. She meant it. He looked at her like the sympathy was a texture he didn't know how to process. Don't be. This is my failure to have accounted for. You can't account for 6 years of loyalty turning. Yes, he said. You can. That's exactly what you should account for. The flatness in his voice was different now, not the controlled flatness of a man managing an audience, but the specific flatness of a man who is furious in a register too deep for surface expression. I knew Volkov was escalating. I should have run a verification sweep on every person with access to sensitive information weeks ago. I didn't because 6 years felt like sufficient data. His eyes moved to the map. It wasn't. Rowan stood and crossed to the corkboard. The topographic map had marks on it she couldn't fully interpret, locations indicated by pins, lines drawn in 2 colors, a key in small handwriting at the lower corner. She studied it for a moment, trying to read the geography of the situation the way she read a patient's chart, looking for the thing that didn't fit, the number outside the expected range, the detail that changed the interpretation of everything adjacent to it. What was the plan for the next 72 hours, she said. Lucien came to stand beside her, close enough that she was aware of his body heat, still elevated, the fever not fully gone, and pointed at a mark in the city's harbor district. Summit with the Volkov leadership. Neutral ground. The proposal was mutual withdrawal from the disputed territory, a formal acknowledgement that Rowan Vale was not to be touched, followed, or used as leverage, and a cessation of direct action against my organization for a period sufficient to renegotiate territorial boundaries. A peace meeting, she said. A performance of a peace meeting, he said. The actual outcome was going to depend on whether the Volkov leadership came in good faith or came in prepared to use the summit as an operational opportunity. And now? And now their man inside this house has presumably informed them that we've identified the tracker, that you're here, and that we're running an internal verification sweep. He paused. The summit is compromised before it begins. Whatever they were planning to do with the peace meeting as cover, they've had to accelerate or abandon it. Or they've already moved, Rowan said. He looked at her. Reyes leaves the perimeter rotation 40 minutes ago. Calls start being made. If he's been in contact with them throughout the day, they already know your fever broke. They know I've been treating you. They know your defensive posture inside this house. She turned from the map to face him. They don't need the summit anymore. They have a real-time picture of what's happening inside your operation, and a physician. She stopped, corrected herself. A nurse who can be used to demonstrate that you're vulnerable, that you needed outside help to manage a wound infection, that you're accessible. She looked at him steadily. They're not going to wait for a summit. They're going to move on the house. Lucien looked at her for a long moment. You think like an operator, he said. I think like someone who spent 3 years anticipating what goes wrong, she said. Same skill set, different application. He turned back to the map. She watched him look at it, really look at it, with the focused totality of someone remapping a situation from new information, and then reach for the radio on the desk. He got 3 words into the call before the first explosion hit. It wasn't close. It was close enough. The windows on the north face of the house lit white for a fraction of a second before the sound arrived. A deep concussive thud that came up through the floor as much as through the air, the kind of blast that doesn't announce itself with drama, but with the more serious language of structural vibration. Rowan grabbed the desk edge. Lucien had the radio to his mouth and was already talking, fast and precise, calling for a situation report from the perimeter in a voice that had shed every unnecessary element and become something purely functional. Voices came back through the radio, fragments. Rowan caught perimeter breach, north fence line, 3 vehicles, and then a second explosion, closer this time, and the lights in the study went out. Emergency lighting kicked on in the hallway, red-toned, low, designed for navigation rather than visibility. Lucien's hand found her arm in the dark. Stay with me, he said. It wasn't a request, and she didn't treat it as one. She grabbed her medical bag from where she'd left it near the door. Instinct, the same instinct that had been packing for worst-case scenarios for 3 years, and stayed inside his arm's reach as he moved into the hallway. Men were moving through the house with the particular purposeful velocity of people executing a plan that had been rehearsed. Doors opened and closed. Someone was shouting in the distance outside. The sound cut short in a way that made Rowan's stomach tighten. The radio in Lucien's hand kept producing fragments of information. Positions, numbers, status updates delivered in the clipped shorthand of people under direct threat. He pulled her into a room off the main hallway. A utility space, she thought, from the smell of it, mechanical systems, and closed the door. Talk to me, she said in the dark. 3 vehicles breached the north perimeter. Armed team, number unclear. My men are in position, but the breach point was where Reyes was stationed, which means the fence at that section was either unlocked or the patrol pattern was fed to them in advance. Where's Reyes now? Unknown. What's the play? He was quiet for a moment. She could hear him breathing, slightly accelerated, not panicked, the breathing of someone whose system was running hard and managing it. We get you to the secondary location. There's a vehicle in the east garage, route pre-planned through the service road that bypasses the main drive. My men hold the north and west sides long enough to give us a window. And you? I go with you. You have a sutured wound and a fever that broke 4 hours ago, she said. Your body is not... Rowan, his voice in the dark was quiet and absolute. I'm aware of my body's current status. I need you to make a decision about whether you're going to argue with me about it while armed men are moving through my property, or whether you're going to move. She moved. The east garage was 60 feet from the utility room through a connecting corridor that smelled like stone and motor oil. They went fast. Lucien slightly ahead, Rowan's hand in contact with his jacket so she could follow his movements in the dark, her bag across her body. She counted the seconds between sounds, the distant percussions of whatever was happening on the north side of the estate. The house had swallowed the chaos into its thick walls and was processing it as a series of muffled reports,
rather than the immediate violence she knew it was. The garage held 4 vehicles. Lucienne went directly to the third, black, nondescript, already backed in toward the exit door in the deliberate preparation of someone who'd established this contingency before needing it. The man waiting beside it was Nolan. Rowan exhaled. Reyes? Lucian said. East Garden, Nolan said. He drew on Carver when she cornered him near the service entrance. She's fine. He's contained. The word carried a specific weight she didn't examine. Who let the vehicles in? He'd disarmed the north sensor array at some point during his rotation. We don't know when. Nolan looked past Lucian to Rowan.
They knew exactly where to breach. How many on the assault team, Lucian said. My people count 8, possibly 10. They're not moving like they expect to find resistance. They're moving like they expect to find a specific room with a specific person in it. Nolan looked at Rowan again when he said it. Rowan understood. They were looking for her. Not primarily for Lucienne, for her. Because a nurse pulled from her apartment and driven to a fortified estate was leverage, was proof of vulnerability, was a story that could be told about the Moretti Syndicate's leadership that would reframe power dynamics in ways that bullets alone couldn't achieve. She was the headline of whatever operation this was. Get in the car, Lucian said to her. She got in. Nolan took the wheel. Lucienne took the passenger seat, the radio still in his hand, and began coordinating the counterposition of his men with the focused efficiency of someone who had run contingencies for exactly this scenario, except for the part where his most trusted lieutenant of 6 years had spent an unknown portion of that time making all of it possible for the other side. The garage door opened. The service road was dark and wet and curved east through a stand of trees before connecting to an unmarked road that Rowan had not seen on the approach. Nolan drove without headlights for the first quarter mile, navigating by memory or GPS or both. Rowan sat in the back with her medical bag and looked through the rear window at the estate. From here she could see what the walls had been muffling, light moving in wrong ways across the north face of the building, the specific cold blue-white of tactical flashlights sweeping in patterns that meant a search in progress. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. The same unknown number from an hour ago. She showed the screen to Lucian. He looked at it, looked at her. Don't answer it. She answered it. Miss Vale. The same voice. Unhurried. I see you've left the building. Smart. Although I suspect you didn't leave alone, which is less smart. A pause. You've been told that Reyes was our man. That's true, as far as it goes. But Mr. Moretti's people are going to tell you something in the next 12 hours that I want you to hear from me first. Say it, she said. The tracking device in your bag, the one you were told was placed by our people during your hospital shift. Another pause, timed for impact. It wasn't placed during your shift. The voice was almost gentle. It was placed 4 days ago, in your apartment, while you were sleeping. A beat. Mr. Moretti's organization has had eyes on you for 4 days, Ms. Vale. He didn't choose you because you happened to treat him in his hour of need. The voice settled into something harder. He chose you weeks ago. The hospital visit was not an accident. He came to you specifically. And you should ask yourself why a man who runs an operation of that size and sophistication needed a trauma nurse badly enough to engineer the encounter, and what he was planning to use you for before the Volkov Circle decided to use you first. The line went dead. The car moved through the dark on a road that Rowan didn't know, away from a house that was burning at its edges, beside a man who had known her name before she knew his. She looked at Lucienne. He was looking at the road ahead. His profile in the dark was exactly as controlled as it had been from the first moment in the trauma bay. The jaw set, the eyes forward, the breathing measured. And she understood, with the specific cold clarity of someone who had just been handed a piece of information they couldn't unknow, that the control had never been about the pain from the wound. It had always been about managing what she knew and when she knew it. 4 days, she said. The muscle in his jaw moved. Look at me, she said. He turned. In the dark of the back seat, their faces were close, and the emergency lighting from the dashboard gave her just enough to read him by. Enough to see that the thing in his expression was not the flat refusal of a man with nothing to answer for, but the harder, more specific look of a man who has an answer he doesn't want to give yet,
because the order in which he gives it matters, and he hasn't finished calculating what order that should be, which was, in its own way, the worst possible answer she could have received. "Tell me," she said, "that the device in my apartment wasn't yours." The car moved through the dark. Rain hit the windshield. Nolan drove and said nothing, which was a kind of answer too. And Lucienne Moretti, who had walked into her emergency room with a knife wound and left with $4,000 worth of her compliance and her silence, and somewhere in the wreckage of the night that followed, something she was furiously unwilling to name, looked at her with the first expression she had seen on his face. He didn't answer her. That was the answer. Rowan turned away from him and looked at the road through the windshield. The dark two-lane cutting through bare trees, rain coming down in sheets now, the headlights finally on and pushing a pale wedge through the black, and did what she had trained herself to do when a situation exceeded its containment. She breathed, she catalogued. She did not allow the feeling to overtake the function. The feeling was considerable. Betrayal has a specific physical signature. She knew it from the inside, had known it since the night Daniel died, when the betrayal was not personal but cosmic, the universe failing to hold up its end of an unspoken agreement about how things were supposed to go for people who worked hard and loved well and showed up. That betrayal had lived in her chest as a specific weight for 3 years. What she was feeling now was different in origin but identical in location. The same sternum deep cold, the same sensation of footing disappearing. She had gotten into a car because she'd believed she was making a rational assessment of risk. She had stayed in a house because she'd believed the information she was given. She had sat beside a man's bed for 6 hours and argued with him and felt something she wasn't finished examining, and none of that, not 1 hour of it, had been accidental. She had been chosen. Before the emergency room, before the knife wound, before any of it, she needed to know why. "Nolan," she said. Nolan's eyes moved to the rearview mirror. "Keep driving," she said. "Don't stop regardless of what happens in this seat." She turned back to Lucien. "Talk. Now. All of it." Lucien looked at her for a moment, assessing, as he always was, the order and presentation of what he was about to hand over. She watched him make the decision to stop calculating and simply speak. "8 weeks ago," he said, "I received intelligence that the Volkov Circle was planning an operation targeting someone in proximity to my organization, not a direct associate, not someone with operational knowledge, but someone with a profile that could be used for leverage. Medical professional, single, financially stressed, no immediate family in close contact, someone who could be approached, pressured, or placed in a compromising position that would then be used to make demands on me." He paused. "The intelligence identified 3 potential targets they were already surveilling. You were one of them." "So you surveilled me first," she said. "I ran an assessment to determine your exposure level and whether you needed to be warned." "That's not the same as—" "I know what it's not," he said. "Let me finish." He looked at her steadily, and she let him, because she needed the full architecture before she decided how to respond to any of it. "During the assessment, my people identified that you were significantly more exposed than the other 2. The Volkov network had already made contact with someone at Mercy St. Jude, we didn't know who yet, and that contact had been feeding them information about your schedule, your habits, your finances. They were further along with you than the other targets." His jaw tightened. "I made a decision to insert myself into your proximity in a way that would give me grounds to bring you into protection without revealing that you were already targeted. Because telling a civilian that a criminal organization has been building a file on her for 6 weeks is—" He stopped, revised. "It's the kind of information that produces one of 2 responses. Either the person goes to law enforcement, which puts both of them in a worse position, or the person goes to ground in ways that are unpredictable and increase their vulnerability. So you staged the hospital visit," she said. "The wound was real," he said. "The choice of hospital was not accidental. The $4,000. A way of establishing contact that gave you agency, something you could accept or reject, something that would make you curious rather than frightened. The phone call this morning. The SUVs outside your building were mine," he said. "The call was to give you a choice about the car." Rowan laughed. It came out short and not particularly amused. "That wasn't a choice.
You had men watching my building and told me the alternative was people you didn't control. Both things were true. But you weighted the information. Yes, he said, simply, without dress. She looked at him. The rain was loud on the roof of the car, and Nolan was a silent presence up front, and the dark outside the windows was the particular dark of distance from anything she recognized. What were you planning to use me for? She said, before Volkov moved first. Protection, he said. Not like this. A sanctioned arrangement. A formal agreement to provide security for you and your grandmother in exchange for medical availability if needed. Off the books, structured as a private contract, with enough separation that you could have declined any specific request. He paused. I was going to present it honestly. I was going to tell you what I was, what the threat against you was, and what I was offering in exchange. When? After establishing enough trust that you'd hear the full proposal before making a decision. And the 4 days. A beat. The device in your apartment was placed to confirm that the Volkov network hadn't already accessed your space. It was a sweep, not a surveillance installation. My people were looking for their equipment, not installing their own. But it was your people in my apartment, she said, while I was sleeping. Yes. The words sat between them. Rowan turned forward again, breathed, counted the trees going past in the headlights, the way she'd counted suture placements, the way she counted everything when counting was the only scaffolding available. I need to think, she said. We have approximately 9 minutes before we reach the secondary location, he said. Think fast. She almost laughed again. Didn't. The secondary location turned out to be a boathouse on the far side of a private lake, utilitarian, low profile, the kind of structure designed to not be what it looked like from the outside. Inside, it was a functioning operations space, generators, communication equipment, weapons storage that Rowan cataloged without reacting to, 4 men already present who came to attention when Lucien entered. He was pale. She could see it in the generator light, the fever pale beneath the cold, the slight alteration in his gait that told her the wound was communicating with him more loudly than he was communicating back. He'd torn something getting out of the car. She'd seen the brief arrest in his movement when his right side took weight, and the cotton ball on his arm had bled through from the removed IV. He stood in the center of the space and began receiving reports from the 4 men, and Rowan stood at the perimeter and watched him run a counter-operation against people who had just attacked his home while managing a healing knife wound and a residual fever, and she held both things in her head simultaneously. The man who had put people in her apartment without her consent, and the man who had genuinely, by every available evidence, been trying to keep her alive before she knew she needed keeping. She wasn't ready to reconcile them. She didn't have time. The summit, she said from across the room. Lucien looked over. They compromised the summit before it happened, she said. But they still need one. They need a visible resolution, some kind of documented event that establishes new territorial boundaries, or they're going to keep sending teams into your properties and the escalation becomes a full war. She crossed the room, stepping around equipment cases, until she was close enough to speak at a volume that didn't include everyone. Reyes is contained. The assault team at the estate is being handled, but the Volkov leadership is still operational, and they're still ahead of you on the information curve. They know everything Reyes knew, which means they know this location is a possibility. We'll be moving again within the hour, Lucien said. That's reactive, she said. You move, they adjust. You move again, they adjust again. You're spending resources on mobility while they're spending resources on positioning. She looked at the map one of the men had pinned to the wall, a different map, the city, the harbor district marked with the same kind of pins she'd seen at the estate. You need to set the terms, not wait for them to set them. Nolan was listening now. The other men were listening without looking like they were listening, which was its own kind of tell. You're describing the summit, Lucien said. I'm describing a summit you control the conditions of, she said. Not one you agree to and then walk into hoping for good faith. One where you arrive already knowing what's in the room. We don't have sufficient intelligence on their current position to— You have me, she said. Silence. They called my phone twice, she said. They're trying to turn me. That means they think I'm turnable. That what I know about the device in my apartment is enough to make me willing to cooperate with them against you. She looked at him steadily.
Let them think they're right. The look that came over his face was complicated. It moved through several things in quick succession: calculation, objection, something that was not quite protectiveness but functioned like it, before settling on the specific expression of a man whose professional instincts are telling him one thing and some newer, less categorized instinct is telling him something else. "No," he said. "It's the best operational option, and you know it. You're not trained for—" "I spent 3 years surviving a life that tried to kill me slowly," she said. "I know how to perform a version of myself that isn't scared. I do it every night shift." She kept her eyes on his. "Call them back. Tell them I want to meet. Tell them I have information about your condition, your current location, your defensive posture. Give them something real enough to be convincing and wrong enough to be useless. And when they come to the meeting thinking they have a source inside your circle, they'll bring leadership," Nolan said from behind her.
She turned. He was looking at the map. "The Volkov leadership doesn't make direct contact for asset management," Nolan said slowly. "But if they think they've turned someone with genuine proximity to Lucian, real-time medical access, location awareness, they send someone senior to handle the handoff personally." He looked at Lucian. "It's the same protocol they used with Reyes. Senior contact, in person, to verify the asset is real before bringing them fully into the network. We get a senior Volkov presence at a location we choose," Lucien said. His voice had gone very quiet. "And you end this in one meeting instead of 6 months of attrition," Rowan said. The room was quiet except for the rain on the boathouse roof and the low hum of the generators. Lucien looked at her for a long time. She watched him work through every angle of it: the operational logic, which was sound, the risk profile, which was significant, and whatever the third thing was that kept pulling his jaw tight and putting a specific quality into the silence before he spoke. "If anything goes wrong," he started. "Things went wrong when I picked up a shift at a hospital that someone had already turned," she said. "I'm already inside the wrong. The question is whether being inside it serves something or just costs something." She picked up her medical bag from where she'd set it on an equipment case. "Call them." He called them. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. Rowan stood close enough to hear both sides. The same accented voice from her phone, now speaking to Lucian directly with the careful neutrality of a man who has learned that emotional flatness is a professional asset, confirming that yes, a meeting between Ms. Valet and a Volkov representative could be arranged, that they had been hoping for exactly this kind of communication, that perhaps Mr. Moretti should know that his nurse had displayed more practical intelligence than most of his lieutenants. Lucien's voice through the call was controlled and calibrated, just enough concession in it to read as a man accepting terms he disliked, not enough to read as a man setting a trap. The location was the abandoned Callaway Opera House in the Harbor District. The Volkov voice suggested it. Lucien accepted it after a pause timed to signal reluctant agreement. The meeting was set for 2 hours out. When the call ended, Nolan immediately began moving. The 4 men in the boathouse shifted into the organized velocity of people executing a plan, equipment, vehicles, communication channels being opened and checked. Lucien stood with the phone in his hand for a moment after the call ended, looking at the space between himself and Rowan. "The Opera House was their suggestion," he said. "I know. Which means they have it prepped. I know that too. Rowan." He said her name the way he had in the utility room in the dark. Not as a command, not as a management tool, but as a thing he needed to say for its own sake. "If I put you in that building and something goes wrong, then you pull me out," she said. "That's what the 200 men are for, isn't it?" Something moved across his face that she didn't have a category for yet. "Get your wound looked at before we leave," she said. "I need to check the suture line. If you tear it open in that building, I'm going to have to close it without a proper kit, and that's going to be significantly less pleasant than the first time." He almost smiled. The same fractional possibility of one that she'd seen in the trauma bay, 12 hours and a lifetime ago. She checked his wound in the small back room of the boathouse while Nolan ran the tactical prep in the front. The suture line had held, but the tissue around it was angrier than she wanted. The physical cost of the night's exertion showing up in the inflammation data the way it always showed up. The body keeping its honest ledger regardless of what the mind decided. She redressed it, gave him a second antibiotic dose, checked his temperature, 99.8, coming down, and pressed 2 fingers against his wrist to count his pulse. His hand covered hers, not moving it, not gripping it, just present. The warmth of his palm over her fingers steady and deliberate in a way that was nothing like the medical. She didn't pull away. "I was going to tell you the truth," he said, "about the apartment, about why I chose you, before tonight, before any of this accelerated. I was going to tell you." "Maybe," she said. "Rowan." "Maybe," she said again, not unkindly. "That's what I have right now. Maybe." She withdrew her hand, not sharply, and closed her bag. "It's enough to work with tonight." He nodded once, accepted it the way he accepted the wound, as a condition to be managed rather than a grievance to be processed. The drive to the harbor took 31 minutes. Rowan sat in the back and looked at the city through the windows. Her city, the place she'd been surviving in for 3 years, the street she drove to double shifts and grocery runs and visits to her grandmother's facility, where she smiled in a particular way that her grandmother couldn't see through, but everyone else could. The city that had a convenience store on Alston Street she hadn't driven past since November, 3 years ago. She was done surviving it, she thought. One way or another, tonight was the end of that particular configuration. The Opera House was a 19th century structure that had been closed for renovation for 6 years, and had the particular atmosphere of a beautiful thing left unattended too long. The facade still imposing, the interior visible through the propped service entrance as something that had been magnificent and was now the kind of empty that accumulates its own atmosphere. High ceilings, a tiered balcony, a stage at the far end with its curtains rotted to rags. Rowan could see all of it from the stage level where Nolan positioned her, centered, visible, alone in a way that was entirely deliberate. Lucienne was somewhere in the building. She didn't know where and didn't ask, because knowing would have changed the quality of her performance, would have put a register into her body language that a man trained to read threats would identify immediately. She stood on the stage level and breathed. Her heart rate was elevated. She acknowledged it, classified it, assigned it to the category of data rather than emergency. 11 years of emergency nursing had not made her fearless. They had made her functional within fear, which was not the same thing but was considerably more useful. 3 men came in through the main entrance at the far end of the hall. She knew immediately that the center one was senior. Not from anything as legible as dress or age. He was mid-50s, gray at the temples, wearing a coat that was expensive without advertising it. But from the way the other 2 positioned themselves relative to him. People protect the thing that matters. The body language of protection is not performable. You either do it or you don't. He walked toward her through the long, empty hall, his footsteps and his men's footsteps echoing in the high space. And Rowan stood and did not move and breathed and tracked everything she could track. He stopped 20 feet from the stage. "Ms. Vale," he said, the accented voice. In person, it had a texture the phone had compressed out, something Eastern European in the vowels, something careful in the spacing of the words. "You've had quite a night." "You have no idea," she said. He almost smiled. "We'd like to make it easier. That's genuinely what we're offering. Mr. Moretti has involved you in a situation you didn't choose. We're offering you a way out of it." "What way?" she said. "Information," he said. "Current location of his organization's liquid assets. The Vermont house." He paused. "The woman. Claire Sutton." He said it without saying it. "And what do I get?" Rowan said. "Clean exit, no further contact. Your grandmother's facility paid for 2 years in advance." He spread his hands in a gesture of reasonableness. "No one has to know you were ever part of this." Rowan looked at him. She thought about the device in her apartment. She thought about $4,000 in an envelope and a man who looked at her like she was worth the full allocation of his attention. She thought about Daniel on the floor of a convenience store and the specific knowledge she'd carried from that night, that the world was not structured around the protection of people who deserved it. That protection was something you built yourself, or you went without it. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He inclined his head. "How many people in this building right now are yours?" His expression shifted.
the first crack in the reasonable surface, and he said, "Ms. Vale." The lights came on. All of them, simultaneously. The full house lighting that had presumably been non-functional for 6 years, blazing on at once with the particular harshness of fluorescent systems that don't warm up gradually, flooding the entire hall from floor to balcony in flat, merciless white. In the balcony above them, Rowan could see Lucy's men, 8 of them, visible and positioned, each with clear sight lines to the hall floor. From the wings on both sides of the stage, 4 more. From the entrance behind the 3 Volkov men, the sound of the door they'd come through being secured. The 2 flanking men reached for weapons. Nolan's voice came from the balcony, loud and even. "Don't!" They didn't. The senior man stood very still. He was looking at Rowan with an expression that had moved past the crack in the surface into something that lived beneath it. Not panic, but the recalibration of a man who has just understood that he is standing in a room where the geometry is entirely wrong for him. 16-3 is a conversation I'd like to avoid. Lucien's voice came from the left wing, and then he was visible, walking onto the stage level with the controlled deliberateness of a man who had rehearsed this entrance and was not going to let a knife wound and a night's worth of fever make it anything less than what it needed to be. He came to stand beside Rowan. She felt him beside her, the warmth from his body, the slight elevation in his breathing that only she was close enough to read, the cost of the walk, and the posture and the performance of absolute composure that he was paying for in the physical currency of a body that was not fully healed. The senior Volkov man looked at Lucien, looked at Rowan, looked at Lucien again. "Victor Sorel," Lucien said, "you came yourself." "I wanted to see what she was," Sorel said. He meant Rowan. The way he said it, what she was rather than who, made something tighten in her jaw. "She's the reason you're standing in a room on my terms instead of yours," Lucien said. "Adjust accordingly." Sorel adjusted. Rowan watched him do it, watched the professional recalibration of a man who understood that the exit from this room required a different posture than the entrance, and who was experienced enough to make that shift without it looking like the concession it was. "What do you want?" Sorel said. "Everything," Lucien said. "We start with the full withdrawal from—" The shot came from the upper balcony, not Lucien's men. The angle was wrong. It came from the back of the house, a position that should have been empty and wasn't, which meant there was a 9th man they hadn't accounted for. A man who had been in the building before any of them arrived and had been still enough and patient enough to wait. The bullet hit Lucien in the left side. Rowan knew it before she heard the sound, felt the impact through the air between them, saw his body absorb it with the specific involuntary interruption of someone struck by a force that bypasses all the control they've built. He went sideways. She caught him. Her hands were on his torso, and the blood was immediate, and her clinical brain registered the location. Left lateral, lower chest, proximity to the heart, and something that was not clinical at all registered everything else at the same time. Chaos swallowed the room. Gunfire from the balcony, return fire from Nolan's men, the 2 Volkov flankers going for their weapons and going down before they cleared their holsters. Sorel dropping behind a row of seats, someone screaming something in a language Rowan wasn't tracking because she was on the floor of the stage with Lucien's blood on both hands and 100% of her attention on the wound and on keeping him. She didn't think. Thinking was the luxury of people who had more than 3 seconds. Rowan pulled Lucien down behind the front lip of the stage. Old hardwood, solid, built in an era when things were constructed to outlast the people who used them, and got her body over his with the particular economy of someone who has performed emergency stabilization in conditions that did not accommodate deliberation. Her hands went to the wound immediately, both palms flat, pressure applied with the full weight of her upper body, because pressure was what the next 60 seconds required and everything else was secondary. He was conscious. She registered that first. His eyes were open and tracking, and the jaw was set in the specific way it set when he was managing pain by reclassifying it as information, which meant his brain was functional and his stubbornness was intact, which were the 2 things she needed most from him right now. "Left side," she said into his ear. "Lower chest. Tell me if you feel it in your shoulder." "No," he said.
tight, breath controlled. Not the lung then, or not yet. The hall was loud with everything happening above and around them. Nolan's voice carrying over the chaos in short operational bursts, the sound of men moving fast on the balcony level. One more shot, and then a different quality of silence that suggested the ninth man had been found and neutralized. Rowan didn't look up. Her entire world had contracted to the 4 inches of Lucian's left side beneath her hands, the specific information the wound was giving her through her palms, and the calculation she was running in the part of her brain that never fully went off shift. Entry point. Left lateral, between the 7th and 8th rib, approximately 5 centimeters from the mid-axillary line. The bullet had hit at a downward angle. She could tell from the drag in the tissue at the wound's lower edge. No exit wound that she could feel with the hand she briefly moved around his back, pressing, probing, reading. The bullet was still inside him. "I need light," she said. Nolan appeared at the edge of the stage. His face had a cut across the left cheekbone that he wasn't acknowledging. He produced a tactical flashlight and held it without being asked for further instruction, which raised him considerably in her estimation. She worked in the white beam of the flashlight on the floor of a 19th century opera house, while somewhere in the building Victor Sorel was being managed by men she couldn't see, and the rain continued to hammer the roof without any concern for what was happening beneath it. The wound was bad, not unsurvivable. She held that assessment carefully, because unsurvivable was a word that had a specific gravity, and she was not ready to apply it, but bad in the way that required a surgical suite and a vascular team and equipment she absolutely did not have on her person. The bleeding was significant, not arterial. She confirmed that with the color and the pressure pattern, and felt something in her chest release 1 degree of tension, but significant, the kind of blood loss that had a clock attached to it. She packed the wound with the trauma dressings from her bag, applying pressure with both hands and leaning her weight into it, and looked at Lucian's face. He was looking at the ceiling. The opera house ceiling, ornate and water-damaged, and very far above them, the plasterwork cherubs and scrollwork visible in the peripheral wash of Nolan's flashlight. "Still with me?" she said. "Still with you," he said. "The bullet's in there. I can't remove it here. I need a surgical team." "I know a real one," she said. "Not a man with a kit in a boathouse. A surgeon with a table and imaging and everything else. I don't care what the security complications are. This is the conversation where you don't tell me no." A pause. His breathing was labored in a way it hadn't been 10 minutes ago. "Nolan," he said. "Already on it," Nolan said from somewhere above the flashlight. Rowan maintained pressure. She counted Lucien's respirations, tracked his pulse at the wrist with 2 fingers while her other hand held the dressing, and did the arithmetic of what she had and what she needed and how much time existed between those 2 quantities. "The man on the balcony," she said. "The 9th man. That wasn't a Volkov Circle asset." It wasn't a question. It had arrived in her head as a full thought. The angle of the shot, the position in the building, the specific target. Not Sorel. Not the flanking men. Lucien. "No," Lucien said. His voice was slower than it had been. She increased the pressure. "Reyes," she said. "Reyes gave them the position," Nolan said from above. "But the shooter wasn't Volkov. The Volkov Circle wanted Lucien functional for the negotiation. A dead head of syndicate creates a power vacuum that benefits no one cleanly." He paused. "The shooter was internal, someone who wanted the summit to fail and the leadership gone." "Someone else inside your organization," Rowan said. "Someone who'd been waiting for exactly this kind of exposure," Nolan said. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Not quite guilt, but the specific texture of a man examining his own intelligence failures. "We were looking at the Volkov penetration. We weren't looking sideways." Lucien made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Politics," he said. "Even here." "Don't talk," Rowan said. "Rowan, you have a bullet in your chest and you're losing blood at a rate that makes conversation a poor use of resources." She checked the dressing. "Be quiet." He was quiet. The next 40 minutes were the longest of her life, and she had a catalog of long minutes to compare them against. Nolan got a vehicle to the service entrance. Moving Lucien required 4 men, and the particular kind of coordination that comes from people who have trained for exactly this scenario. And even with all of it, the movement from the stage floor to the vehicle's back seat cost Lucian something visible. A tightening around the eyes, a controlled exhale that she heard as the suppressed expression of pain he refused to perform for an audience. She got in with him, kept pressure on the wound for the entire drive, her hands going numb from the sustained compression, her knees on the seat, her body angled at the particular uncomfortable geometry of emergency care in a moving vehicle. She talked to him, not constantly, not about anything meaningful, just the low-grade ongoing verbal contact that kept him tethered to the frequency of consciousness, rather than the quieter frequency that blood loss and shock can pull a person toward when the noise level drops. She told him about the first patient she'd ever lost. She told him about her grandmother's garden before the assisted living, the roses that her grandmother had grown with a specific and territorial pride. She told him about the Sunday morning when Daniel burned the eggs so badly that the smoke alarm went off and the neighbor knocked to check if they needed help, and Daniel answered the door with a spatula and the particular expression of a man who was not going to acknowledge the smoke behind him. She hadn't talked about that in 3 years. She hadn't said it out loud to anyone. Lucien's hand found her knee in the dark of the back seat and pressed once, briefly, and she kept talking. The surgeon was a woman named Dr. Adeyes Okafor, who worked out of a private facility 40 minutes south of the city, and who clearly had a prior relationship with Nolan that she was equally clearly not pleased about being activated at 4 a.m. She was in her 50s, direct in the specific way of people who have made enough irreversible decisions under pressure that they've stopped decorating their sentences, and when she looked at the wound, she looked at Rowan instead of at any of the men in the room. "You packed this?" she said. "Yes." "It's good work." She was already moving, directing her team with the minimal word efficiency of a surgeon in operative mode. "How long ago?" 53 minutes. "Blood type?" "O positive," Lucian said from the table. "Of course it is," Okafor said, with the tone of someone who had opinions about dramatic men with convenient blood types. And then she was fully operational, and Rowan was ushered to the waiting area by a nurse who had the practiced gentleness of someone who has moved distressed people out of surgical spaces many times. Rowan sat in a plastic chair in a white hallway and looked at her hands. They were covered in Lucian Moretti's blood to the mid-forearm. She hadn't noticed, in the car, how much. Under the fluorescent lights of the hallway, it was very visible. Dark, already drying at the edges, the particular evidence of a night that had cost more than she'd agreed to pay when she picked up her medical bag and walked out her apartment door. She didn't cry. She sat with her hands in her lap and breathed and did what she had always done, which was wait for the part that came after. Nolan brought her a towel and a cup of coffee and sat in the chair next to her without speaking, which she found she appreciated more than any version of speech would have been. After a while, he said, "He was going to tell you. You don't have to." "I know I don't." He looked at the wall across from them. "I've worked for him for 9 years. In 9 years, I've seen him make decisions that I would not have made and couldn't have made, and the reason the organization is still functional is largely because of the quality of those decisions." He paused. "I've also watched him talk himself out of things that weren't operational problems, things that were just human, things he didn't have a protocol for." He turned his head slightly toward her without fully turning it. "You were the first time I've seen him make a decision based on something that didn't have a clean cost-benefit structure." Rowan looked at her hands. "The apartment," she said. "He overruled me on that," Nolan said. "I wanted to approach you directly. Controlled disclosure, offer on the table, your choice. He said you'd run. That you'd been in controlled loss mode for 3 years, and a direct offer from someone like him would read as one more thing coming to take something from you." He paused. "He wasn't wrong about your psychology. He was wrong about the method." "Yes," she said. "He was." They sat in silence. The coffee was bad and she drank it anyway. "Who was the shooter?" she said. Nolan was quiet for a moment. "Man named Calder. He's been with the organization 11 years. He had a claim to the leadership structure that Lucien's continued presence was blocking. He'd been patient." A pause. Reyes didn't know about Calder. Reyes thought he was working exclusively for Volkov. Calder was using the Volkov operation as cover.
feeding Reyes the Volkov connection so that if anything unraveled, the investigation would look at external penetration and not internal maneuvering. Where is Calder now? Not a problem, Nolan said, in the specific way that meant the answer was permanent. Rowan nodded once. She didn't ask for elaboration. She was in the world she was in, and the world she was in had a different structure than the one she'd been trained to work within. And she had made choices tonight that meant those two structures were now permanently adjacent in her life, in ways she would have to figure out how to live with. She was not, she discovered, as disturbed by this as she would have been 12 hours ago. That was either growth or damage. She wasn't certain yet which. Dr. Okafor came out 3 hours and 40 minutes later. She looked tired in the way surgeons look tired. The specific exhaustion of people who have been doing precise work in conditions that required complete presence, now releasing back into the ordinary density of the world. He'll live, she said, with the delivery of a woman who found the drama of the situation unnecessary. The bullet missed the heart and the aorta. It nicked an intercostal artery, which is why the blood loss was significant. We repaired it, removed the bullet, the lung is intact. She looked at Rowan. The original wound was sutured with more skill than that situation deserved. If the infection had progressed another 6 hours, he'd have had a more complicated night than he did. Thank you, Rowan said. Don't thank me, Okafor said. Make him stop doing this. She looked at Nolan. That goes for you too. Then she went back through the door, and the hallway was quiet again, and Rowan sat with the news that he would live and waited to feel something she could name. What she felt was tired. Bone-deep, structural tired. The exhaustion of a person who has been running on the minimum viable fuel of survival for so long that the body has forgotten what it's like to stop. She went in to see him when they let her. The room was small and functional, and he looked wrong in it. Too large for the bed, too much presence for the institutional beige. He was awake, more or less. The anesthesia still had weight in his eyes, blurring the edges of the control that he wore as automatically as most people wore their faces. She sat beside the bed. He turned his head and looked at her. The full allocation attention was there, even through the anesthetic haze, reduced in bandwidth but not in quality. I heard you talking, he said. His voice was rough, barely above a baseline. You were in surgery. Before that, in the car. A pause. The eggs. She looked at her hands, cleaned now, the blood gone, but the memory of it sitting in the skin somehow. You weren't supposed to hear that. I know. His hand moved on the blanket toward her. She looked at it for a moment before she put her hand over it. His fingers turned and closed around hers with the careful grip of a man who understood that the thing he was holding was not required to stay. I'm sorry, he said. The apartment, the staged approach. The way He stopped. Breathed. The breathing was shallower than she wanted, but within the range that Okafor's work had made survivable. I built a structure around you before I asked you if you wanted to be inside it. That was wrong. It was, she said. I told myself it was operational necessity. Was it? A long pause. Outside the small window of the recovery room, the sky was doing something. Lightening at its lowest edge, the first dilution of dark that meant the night was spending its last reserves. No, he said. Partly. And partly, I didn't know how to approach something I didn't have a protocol for. A nurse, she said. A person, he said, who looked like the world had been taking things from her for a long time, and who was still showing up. His hand tightened slightly around hers. I didn't know what to do with that except build a perimeter around it. Rowan looked at him. The honesty of it, undecorated, slightly ruined by the anesthesia's removal of his usual architectural control, sitting in the air between them like something that had been waiting a long time to be said, landed in her chest and sat there. Victor Sorel, she said. In custody, Lucian said. Nolan's people held him at the Opera House. He'll be transferred before morning to somewhere that creates appropriate motivation for cooperation. He paused. He'll provide documentation of the Volkov Circle's financial structure in exchange for an arrangement that keeps him alive and out of both criminal and federal reach. The arrangement will hold for approximately 6 months, at which point the documentation will have been used sufficiently to make the Volkov organization non-functional,
and at that point the arrangement's terms will be reviewed. Reviewed, she said. The people Claire Sutton can identify, he said, the financial pathways, the operational contacts. Sorrell adds to that. Together, it's sufficient for a federal case that doesn't require testimony from anyone inside my organization. She looked at him. You're going to give it to the FBI. I'm going to make it available, he said carefully, through a channel that preserves the anonymity of the source and does not create a direct line between the Moretti organization and federal cooperation. But it goes to them. The Volkov Circle runs trafficking networks, he said. His voice was quiet and flat. Not product trafficking. People. Primarily from Eastern Europe, transit through 3 port cities. I've known the outline of it for 2 years. Sorrell's documentation provides the specific architecture. A pause. That information goes to the FBI within 72 hours through a source they won't be able to trace back here. Rowan sat with that for a moment. The complexity of the man in front of her, the parts that were genuinely dangerous and the parts that had genuine lines, the empire built from vengeance that had somewhere in its foundation a father and a mother and a child who learned the worst lesson possible about what the world did to people who couldn't protect themselves, sat in the room with them and breathed. Claire Sutton, she said. She comes out from Vermont. Yes. She cooperates with whatever investigation follows. If she chooses to. He looked at her. I don't hold people against their will. You held me. I kept you alive, he said. There's a distinction. There is, she said. I'm still deciding what to do with it. The sky outside was lighter now. The gray of early morning, the specific gray that promised neither warmth nor storm, just the neutral continuation of time. She sat beside him while the gray deepened, and his hand held hers with the particular grip of someone who understood they were not owed the thing they were holding, and she let him hold it. When the morning shift came to check on him, she was still there. She went home 3 days later. Not her apartment, Nolan arranged another location, temporary, while the question of the hospital penetration was resolved. The contact inside Mercy St. Jude turned out to be an orderly named Marcus Webb, who had been feeding the Volkov network scheduling information for 8 months in exchange for the settlement of a debt that the Volkov people had arranged for him to accrue. He cooperated fully when the alternative was presented to him. He resigned from Mercy St. Jude the following week for reasons his supervisor documented as personal. The specific file on Rowan Vale that the Volkov network had compiled, her schedule, her finances, her habits, the photographs of her apartment entrance, was deleted from 3 servers and a backup drive. She was told this. She didn't feel clean. She understood she wasn't supposed to feel clean, because clean was not the available outcome. She returned to Mercy St. Jude on a Tuesday, 10 days after she'd left, and walked through the emergency entrance at the start of an overnight shift and stood at the nurse's station and looked at the bay where she'd stitched a man who'd already chosen her, and felt the specific weight of knowing that the ordinary architecture of her working life had been a stage set for longer than she'd understood. Then she pulled up the first chart of the night and started work. Because the work was real. Whatever else had been constructed around it, the work itself was real. The patients were real. The wounds were real. The small, irreducible fact of being present in the room where someone needed presence was real. That hadn't been staged. That wasn't something anyone could reach back into and compromise retroactively. She held on to that. Lucienne recovered at the private facility for 2 weeks. She visited on days that were not her shift days, driving the 40 minutes south in the reliable gray dawn or the late afternoon, depending on what her schedule permitted, and she sat in the recovery room chair and argued with him about his medication compliance and watched him rebuild the layers of himself back into the configuration she'd first encountered. The control coming back gradually, the architecture reasserting, the man who read rooms and weighted variables and had built an empire from the absence of protection, re-emerging from the man who had said things under anesthesia and residual fever that he would now have to decide what to do with in full sobriety. He decided to say them again. Sober, deliberate, without the excuse of diminished consciousness. The second week of his recovery, on a late afternoon when the light through the facility windows was the particular quality of winter afternoon light that turns everything slightly gold and makes it look more significant than it intends to be. He told her about his parents, not the version she'd heard in The Fever, the clipped geographic version, the landscape description, the actual version, what he remembered of them, what he'd kept of them inside a life that had since been built entirely on their absence, his father's voice, his mother's hands. He told her about the 11-year-old boy in a house full of men who had done the worst thing imaginable and then gone about their lives with the specific callousness of people who had decided the thing they'd done was a transaction, settled and closed. He didn't tell it for sympathy. She could tell that from the delivery, flat, precise, making no requests of her emotional inventory. He told it because he'd decided she had the right to know the full architecture of what she was dealing with. She told him about the convenience store, not the clinical version she'd carried for 3 years, the event, the wound, the moment of understanding, the actual version. The thing before, Daniel laughing in the car on the way there, the specific joke he'd made that she couldn't remember the punchline of now and had spent 3 years trying to recover. The thing after, the feeling in her hands for days, the sense memory that wouldn't clear. They sat in the gold light and held what they'd handed each other and did not pretend it was lighter than it was. "What happens to your organization?" she asked him on the last day before his discharge. He was dressed, sitting on the edge of the bed, with his coat over the back of the chair, looking like himself in the full sense for the first time since the opera house. "It continues," he said. "With Sorrell's documentation being processed and the Volkov network dismantled, the territorial pressure on the East Coast reduces significantly. The next 12 months are a consolidation period." He paused. "I've asked Nolan to begin an audit of the entire operational structure, every person with access to sensitive information, every potential pressure point." He looked at her. "Starting with the identification of anyone else who might become a target, the way you became a target." "Civilians," she said. "People in proximity," he said. "It was a vulnerability I'd been managing inadequately." "And Claire Sutton?" "She's in Boston. She found an apartment last week. She's talking to a lawyer about the terms of her federal cooperation." He looked at his hands briefly. "I covered her first month's expenses." "She didn't want more than that." Rowan nodded. "She shouldn't take more than that." "No," he said. The discharge paperwork was minimal, the kind of medical paper trail that existed only in the specific way required to exist and no further. Okafor handed it to Nolan with the expression of a woman whose invoices would be settled promptly and whose questions would remain rhetorical. In the parking lot, in the gray afternoon, Lucien stood beside the vehicle Nolan had brought and looked at Rowan with the full allocation attention that she had learned over the past 2 weeks to receive without the vertigo it had initially produced. "I'm going back to my apartment," she said. "I know." "I'm going back to my shift on Tuesday." "I know." "I'm not—" She stopped, found the right words, which took a moment. "I'm not available to be inside a perimeter. I'm not available to be a protected asset or a managed civilian or anything that has a protocol attached to it." "I know that too," he said. "What I might be available for," she said, "is a conversation. On terms that aren't operational, at a time that I choose, in a location that I choose." He looked at her. Something in his expression was quieter than anything she'd seen on him yet. Not the control quiet of a man managing a situation, but the other kind of quiet. The kind that doesn't have strategy in it. "That's more than I should ask for," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." She drove herself home in the gray afternoon, hands steady on the wheel, the city reconstituting itself around her as she came back into its geography. She took the route that went past Alston Street, which she hadn't done in 3 years. She didn't stop. She drove past it at a normal speed and looked at the ordinary block with its convenience store and its parked cars and its entirely neutral face and let it be what it was, a place where something happened, a place that existed in the past in the way that the past is always exactly as present as you make it. She made it smaller. Not gone. Smaller. Her apartment smelled like the radiator and the 2-day-old coffee and the leak under the sink that still needed fixing. It was clean. Someone had been through it while she was gone, and she didn't ask who, didn't ask what they'd checked for or cleared. She made new coffee and stood at her window and looked at the street below,
where the black SUV had been parked 10 days ago in what felt like a different version of her life. The street was just a street, a pigeon on the opposite sill, regarding the world with its red-edged eye. A delivery truck double-parked. The ordinary insistence of a city on its own continuity. She looked at the number in her phone that Lucien had used to call her that first morning. She looked at it for a long time. She put the phone down, finished her coffee, got her tools from under the sink, and started fixing the leak herself. It took 40 minutes. She cut her thumb once, slightly, on the pipe wrench, and sucked the blood off and kept going. When the leak was sealed, she ran the tap and checked the joint, and ran it again. And when the floor stayed dry, she sat back on the kitchen tile and looked at the cabinet under the sink and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness. Not yet. Or not simply. The specific, uncomplicated satisfaction of a thing that was broken being fixed by her own hands. 6 months later, winter came back to the city. It came in the way it always did. First as a smell in the air, then as the kind of cold that gets into the architecture of things. Then as snow that fell on a Thursday evening while Rowan was finishing a day shift and walked out through the emergency entrance to find it settling on the concrete in the light of the entrance lamps. She stood in the snow for a moment, breathing the cold air, before walking to her car. Her grandmother's facility had been paid in full for 2 years. She'd asked once where the money had come from. She hadn't asked again. Her grandmother was in a garden therapy program now, growing things in the facility greenhouse, with a focused contentment that Rowan drove 40 minutes to witness twice a month, and which was, without question, the best thing in her life. The leak under her sink had not returned. Her medical bag had a new front pocket, with a new inner lining, which she had checked twice. It was clean. She had, over 6 months, spent time with a man on terms she had set, in locations she had chosen, in conversations that were not operational. She had learned that he made coffee badly and fixed it by adding more of everything, that he owned 3,000 books that he rotated through with the systematic thoroughness he applied to everything, that he slept badly and woke early and stood at windows in the way that people stand at windows when they're watching for things that are no longer coming, that he was capable of silence that was genuinely empty, no calculation in it, no management, just the silence of someone present in a room. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, considerably more than she'd had 3 years to learn about Daniel, which was a thought that arrived without guilt now, most days. The guilt had been a long time dissolving, and it had not dissolved cleanly or completely, but it had dissolved. She thought about survival a lot those 6 months, about the difference between the version of it she'd been practicing, the attenuated, minimal resource, keep-the-lights-on version, and the other version. The version that required more from you. The version that asked you to want things that could be taken away, to stand in proximity to loss with your hands open instead of braced. The version that was indistinguishable on the outside from living. She drove home through the first snow. The city was quiet with it, the edges of everything softened, the familiar streets made briefly strange and clean. She parked in her building's lot and sat for a moment with the engine running, watching the snow. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A text. The number she knew. The lake froze last night. First time in 4 years, apparently. She looked at it for a moment. Then she typed back, "Don't go out on it. Your left side isn't healed enough for ice." His response came in seconds. 3 words. "Yes, it is." She smiled. It happened before she decided to do it, which was how the best things happened. She turned the engine off, walked through the snow to her building, took the elevator to the 4th floor and let herself into the apartment that smelled like coffee she'd made that morning, and a radiator that worked, and a future she had not finished building yet. She hung up her coat. She made more coffee. She stood at her window and looked at the snow falling on the street below and thought, this is what it feels like. Not the dramatic version. Not the version with the opera house and the blood and the 200 men and the things you say to each other in recovery rooms when the armor is temporarily insufficient. The other version. The one that's just a window and a warm cup and the world continuing in its indifferent way outside the glass while inside, something persists. Something that had been called survival for so long it had forgotten its other name. She looked at the street. She looked at the snow. She looked at the city she had been living in without living in it, and felt it become, incrementally and without ceremony, hers again. Outside,
The snow fell without drama and without hurry, covering everything equally, the good and the damaged and the things that were slowly, stubbornly becoming themselves again. Rowan Vale stood at her window and watched it come down, and for the first time in 3 years, she did not feel like a woman surviving the present. She felt like a woman standing at the beginning of something she had not yet decided the shape of. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything.